So this is Kassidy. Hello, Kassidy. And she is the Conservation Area Manager at Long Island Invasive Species Management Area. So that's LIISMA for short. So Kassidy, if you would like to quickly introduce yourself and the program for tonight.
Yes, thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so I'm Kassidy Robinson. I'm the Conservation Area Manager with LIISMA, or the Long Island Invasive Species Management Area. I've been with LIISMA for a little over 2 years now. I was formerly the Field Project and Outreach Manager, doing some more education initiatives. And now I'll talk about our conservation areas as well a little bit later in the presentation. Tonight we'll talk about tools for identifying and managing invasive species, as well as a little bit of an introduction to LIISMA. So LIISMA is a group of organizations working together to reduce the threat of invasive species, to protect Long Island and New York City, to protect local ecosystems in New York City and on Long Island. We're funded by the Environmental Protection Fund and administered by the New York State DEC. And our host organization is the Long Island Native Plant Initiative. And we stretch from Staten Island to the eastern reaches of Suffolk. So we are one of 8 PRISMs in New York State, and these are partnerships for regional invasive species management. Our goal is to protect and restore Long Island's and New York City's most important ecosystems. And Long Island is actually one of the most biodiverse regions in the state due to our coastal ecosystems. We have a lot of rare habitats such as coastal plain ponds and grasslands. And we have a lot of endemic species and rare and threatened species as well. So we are just a team of 4 or 5 people here at LIISMA, and we cover, like 5 counties. So how are we going to address the threat of invasive species, especially when there are over 600 invasive species in our area affecting us? So we have to prioritize and be very strategic about our work, and we prioritize by invasive species and by conservation area. So this is my realm as Conservation Area Manager. We have 13 ISPZs. These are invasive species prevention zones encompassed in management complexes. So invasive species prevention zones are relatively large areas that are relatively unaffected by invasive species. They may have some, but they're not completely degraded by them. And they're areas of high biodiversity as well. So they're also encompassed in these management complexes that act kind of as a buffer around them for us to pay special attention to any invasive species that get in that area. And we also prioritize by species. So here's the invasion curve. You may have seen this before. On the left, towards the bottom, closer to the introduction of a new species, not a lot of time has passed and the species has not established itself or taken up a lot of area. There's still a high likelihood that we could fully remove this plant or invasive species. And as time passes, we go towards the right and up, it becomes more costly to control them as invasive species take much more area and a lot of time has passed. And somewhere between these two extremes, the public typically begins to become aware of the invasive species at hand. So we aim to not only educate people about invasive species earlier on in the curve, so that we can all act together to prevent the invasive species establishment. But that's also the sweet spot where we like to implement management and early detection and rapid response. So we want to know when the invasive species has just come in, and we want to try to remove it as soon as possible while it's more likely that we can eradicate it and it's less costly and less time consuming. So we want to find and manage new infestations before they spread and become established when control is still feasible. So that's our early detection and rapid response program. And this ties in with something called the tier list. This is a categorized list of invasive species across the LIISMA region and New York State. So this helps inform management by creating priorities for us and put species in categories based on their impact, location, abundance, distribution, and feasibility of response. So we have tier 1 species that we can still prevent and detect early on. They're not yet here, and they're a huge priority for us to keep our eyes out for before they get here. And then when they are here, they're what's called a tier 2. With the goal of eradication, we want to fully remove them very quickly. If we find out as soon as that species arrives here, that's ideal, but that's not always the case. And then as things become more widespread, if we're not able to detect them early, There'll be a tier 3 or a tier 4 where we'll mostly focus on containing that species spread and keeping it where it is and controlling it locally. So since we're a partnership of organizations, that's where a lot of our partners come in. They are able to control invasive species locally at different sites like local parks and preserves. We work with the DEC and state parks and lots of nonprofits and townships as well. So our partners do a great job of locally controlling these invasive species. And just because something is a tier 4 as opposed to a tier 1 or 2, that doesn't mean it's less important. It just means we're going to strategically address it in a different way. Just to go over some definitions before we keep diving into invasive species, we'll compare native and invasive and some other definitions. So native species, I'm sure you're all super familiar with these. They are developed over hundreds or thousands of years in a particular region or ecosystem. And to represent this, we have an acorn representing an oak tree. And these are species that have developed complex relationships with other organisms too. So they're deeply interdependent. And that's one of the reasons why invasive species kind of disrupt these interdependent cycles. Our native species can't feed on the invasive species and things like that, so it affects the food chain. Non-native species are those species that are introduced to a new place where they're not previously found, and they may have a beneficial or neutral impact, not necessarily negative, such as like agricultural crops. You can see like a citrus here. They've been introduced, they're either benefiting us or not harming us, and they're not escaping farms and spreading into natural environments. Now, invasive species are those non-native species that do harm the environment, economy, and or human health. And that's mostly what we'll be focusing on, of course. And as a side note, there are neo-native species that are range-shifting species that have established themselves beyond their historical range. So you may have heard of the southern pine beetle. That's an insect that has originated in the southeast United States. It's native to that area. And with humans facilitating increased like pathways for their spread, urbanization, shipping, all sorts of things like that, as well as climate change, creating possibly a more suitable environment for them here over time. The southern pine beetle has made its way to our region, and it's unfortunately negatively impacting our pitch pine trees and pine barren ecosystems. So those are some definitions for you, and we'll dive some more into invasive species now. So just a quick overview, since there's a lot of topics to cover, some key points. Invasive species are pretty much always spread by human activity, whether it's through horticulture, the aquarium trade, landscape or aquarium dumping. We may spread them on our boots when we hike from place to place, our boats, whether we kayak or have a boat that we take out, and on our equipment. It could be even gardening equipment or landscape equipment. As well as firewood. If you go camping, we could transport invasive insects incidentally. Invasive species also have a competitive advantage. In their introduced range, they have few predators, if any at all. They're highly adaptable to a range of different conditions. They're fast growing. They often thrive on disturbance. They don't just tolerate disturbance, they may even thrive on it. And they're often prolific, producing a lot of seeds that will spread really effectively. And lastly, they, due to their competitive advantage, will harm local ecosystems in a variety of ways, including degrading and diminishing functional habitat space, decreasing resilience, and increasing competition. Why does this matter? Invasive species threaten nearly every aspect of our world and are one of the greatest threats to New York's biodiversity, agriculture, and outdoor recreation. So if you like spending time outside or even having a glass of wine or eating some vegetables, invasive species are definitely going to affect you. So now we can dive into some tools for invasive species identification. And these might not just apply for invasives, but natives as well. So let's say we have this unknown plant. It's shown up either in your garden or a local park that you like to go to, and you haven't seen it before. You're pretty sure it's not native because you might be a pro in that area, and you don't recognize it. So let's go through some tools and some ways you might go about addressing and identifying it. So here are some field guides that we recommend. On the right, for native species identification, you guys may already be familiar with these. There's Peterson's Trees and Shrubs Field Guide or Newcomb's Wildflower Guide. And they have dichotomous keys in them in which you'll basically go through like a flow chart kind of thing, examining the plant's characteristics, such as if it's herbaceous or woody, its leaf shape and edges, if they're serrated or smooth, branching and leaf arrangement, whether they're opposite one another or alternating along the branch or the stem, and what the flowers and seeds look like. And the only drawback of these two guides, or generally dichotomous keys in general, they may heavily rely on plant being in flower. And so that can make things challenging if you're looking at something that doesn't yet have flowers. But that's why we have a lot of different tools to work with. And for invasive species field guides, there's the Plant Invaders of the Mid-Atlantic Natural Areas. LIISMA has some physical copies of this, so if you ever catch us at a tabling event, we can likely give you one of these. But it's also available online. You can view a PDF of the previous edition, and it's got lots of thorough identification tips, photos, and management strategies for invasive species, both common and emerging. And also some more common ones. Maybe these are things you might be more likely to find in a garden, the Weeds of the Northeast, and that one you could buy online as well. And the New York State Prohibited and Regulated Invasive Plants Guide. This is a DEC guide showing some common invasive species. Generally, they're more common because these are the ones that have demonstrated that they're problematic enough to warrant becoming prohibited or regulated in New York. So this is another good guide. You can find a PDF online as well. I've collected some resources, and Dee's going to distribute that to you all later as well. So let's say we didn't bring our field guides with us. That's a lot of books to carry, or we just don't have them. You can use iNaturalist. Some of you may already have this. It's a great app for identifying species. Now they have an updated version that works a little bit more like Seek, where you just open up the camera in the app and it will suggest an ID immediately. But you can also post observations, and the community will assist in identifying your plant or animal as well. So back to our mystery plant. Let's say we use iNaturalist, and unfortunately, it's not always perfect because it does rely on artificial intelligence to assist with those instant ID features. So it's gotten us down to the genus level. It knows that that yellow flowered plant is a loosestrife. It's in the genus LIISMA. So from here, we're going to go and see how we can continue honing in on what the exact species is, because this is already a lot of options. The New York Flora Atlas is a great guide for looking at all species of plant found in New York, not just native or invasive, one or the other. So you can actually do an advanced search and filter by county or species you're looking for, all sorts of different criteria. And so I've gone and plugged in the advanced search. I've searched for Suffolk County and the genus LIISMA. So these are all the LIISMA that can be found in Suffolk. And you can see over here on the right, it tells you whether that plant is native or non-native, yes or no. And it's not going to tell you if it's invasive, but we have more resources for that too. And here is the tier ranking list. This is through the New York Natural Heritage Program, and this will list all of the species that are classified as invasive in New York. And you can also filter this by region. So I've gone and selected LIISMA here. Gone and selected LIISMA, as well as filtered for the taxa type, including aquatic plant and terrestrial plant. You can do so also for animals, aquatic, terrestrial, or microorganisms. And you can filter by tier, but that's not going to really be useful to us in this case. But if you do want to look at more common species, you can just filter and look at the tier 4 and tier 3. And if you're interested in the emerging species, you can look at tier 1 and tier 2. And it will tell you how that plant is classified, or that species is classified for our region. So I've gone and searched for LIISMA that are considered invasive in New York, and we have these 4 species: yellow garden loosestrife, creeping jenny or moneywort, yellow gooseneck yellow loosestrife, and spotted loosestrife. So we'll dive a little bit more into each of those. Now on the LIISMA site, LIISMA.org/species, we have some of the invasive species in New York. Mostly all of the species that we work with in our region are on this site. It's not an exhaustive list because there are over 600. That's a lot of species to put up. But generally the most common ones are going to be found here. So there is a species page for this plant that we are seeking to identify. You could be exploring that, and each of these species pages will include things like detailed ID tips, photos, and in addition to management strategies, lots of different management techniques. So back to that Lysimachia genus, these are those 4 that we were able to find on the tier list. These are the 4 invasive Lysimachia. So creeping jenny, that looks like it's kind of sprawling around the ground. That's not exactly the plant we were looking at. Gooseneck loosestrife, the color, flowers is all wrong. Spotted loosestrife, that's getting closer. And yellow garden loosestrife, that looks pretty similar too. But since we were exploring this plant on the LIISMA website as well, we remembered that the invasive Lysimachia yellow garden loosestrife that's on the LIISMA site has a very defining feature that is these red margins or margins on the sepals or leaves that encase the flower bud. So that can define this plant and tell us that we were looking at yellow garden loosestrife. And all of this is to say that it will often take a variety of resources and research to be sure that you're arriving at the right ID for a plant. But if it's a more common species, if you type into Google and do a search, shrub plant with round leaves that are red and thorns, you will most likely come up with red barberry as your ID. So this is how you'd go through and identify something a little more tricky. You'd use a bunch of resources, but Google is always there for more common species as well. And you could always just explore the LIISMA site or some of those other resources I mentioned to just explore around and see what species it might be. So now I'll go into an overview of some management techniques for invasive species. The main types of management are biological control, which is using natural enemies to target a host, chemical control using herbicides or pesticides to target pests, cultural control, which targets changing the environment or human behavior to address invasives. So that's kind of a broad category. Mechanical control using machinery such as mowers, tillers, hoeing, and more. And physical manual control, which is hand pulling, digging, mulching. You yourself are doing the labor with just some hand tools. And integrated pest management, which is using a combination of control methods for increased effectiveness. Now, that's very useful in an agricultural setting, and it also kind of applies specifically to chemical control by seeking to minimize the amount of chemical inputs and prevent resistance to herbicides. So some of the principles of integrated pest management can be useful because we're drawing from a lot of different sources and techniques, but may not be necessarily related if we're not doing chemical control. And something not mentioned here is how effective prevention is at managing invasive species. Preventing them in the first place is the very best thing we can do. It's the most cost-effective method and the most energy-saving and time-saving and the most effective way to manage invasive species. And prioritization. So I was kind of getting at this earlier with our tier system. So LIISMA prioritizes invasive species by site. We want to protect our high quality areas that don't have a lot of invasive species, and we want to target the new invasive species. So if you're applying that to a site level and you have this garden or this park that you're protecting, and there's a new species that arrives that you've never seen before and you know it's invasive, you've gone through the process and identified it, you know it's invasive, and you'll want to get that out of there as soon as you can. You'll do some research and act quickly, do the early detection and rapid response style of management. And in addition, you can prioritize your site by priority, like conservation targets. So if you have this one area that has no invasive species, it's really biodiverse, it's got lots of great habitat for wildlife, that is an area you'll want to focus on protecting rather than spending all your time and energy pouring into an area that's really highly degraded already, unfortunately. And while that can feel like, how can you ignore this area that needs help? While you're, focusing all your energy on that area, the intact area with not a lot of invasive species is potentially going to get new invasive species and start becoming degraded. So I would suggest preventing invasive species introduction on your site, acting early, prioritizing protecting those areas and excluding invasive species from them when they're not already present and minimizing their impact. And then when there's time, addressing the more dense populations of invasive species. So you can kind of see how it's like a tiered system to ensure that your efforts are being maximized in their impact. So now we'll dive deeper a little bit into a couple of those methods I mentioned. For mechanical control, mowing is most effective on grasses, forbs, in suppressing and preventing seed set although you should avoid mowing plants that regenerate by fragments, such as knotweed. You will end up spreading them more, unfortunately, if you mow them, because you don't want to leave any fragments behind. And that goes for other methods too. You don't want to do any mechanical controls where you're going to be leaving fragments behind for species like knotweed. And mowing can be effective for mugwort, although mugwort can spread by fragments. You'll just want to be careful and kind of implement that when it's one of the last resorts. But I have heard of this being effective for suppressing mugwort, especially if you're just trying to keep it from going to seed and spreading to new areas. Hoeing and tilling can be used for shallow-rooted or unestablished weeds. The example I read about was dandelions, but that's not really too much of a concern of ours. Girdling is using a chainsaw or axe to create a deep cut at the base of the tree. And this will interrupt the flow of nutrients and materials in the tree. This is best implemented in fall when the photosynthetic material of a tree is bringing energy down to the roots to store for winter. So by girdling in the fall, you'll kind of interrupt that flow, and the roots will not get as much nutrients and will be negatively impacted, possibly die. This is best for trees that don't resprout from the roots. And while tree of heaven does sucker a lot, if you try to cut it, if you girdle it, it may die in a different way that is not going to signal the tree to create suckers. Chopping is cutting the plant material with machinery, and this is best done in combination with herbicide or digging. So you could be mechanically chopping a plant. Maybe you have like a brush cutter. And I would suggest that when there's a lot of plant material in the way, maybe it's a multiflora rose bush and it's going to scratch you up if you don't chop it yet first, and you'll, clear some of the brush away so you can access the stump and try to remove that. And you can also install barriers. These are plastic barriers, either in the water, there's aquatic application as well, or underground to contain a species. And this can be effective for running bamboo species and potentially knotweed, since they're so aggressive and really hard to treat. Sometimes barriers are the last resort. And manual control, hand pulling is best done before seed set and when the soil is moist for herbs, small shrubs, and saplings. And this allows for removal of the root system for some plants. As a side note, one of the species that you may have in mind that's easiest pulled, perhaps it's a pest in your garden or favorite park, garlic mustard. This one comes up super easy. However, research has shown that garlic mustard actually thrives on the disturbance of pulling up a plant. So after pulling garlic mustard, its seeds in the seed bank may be more likely to germinate. So in pulling it, you may be creating an environment that's just going to encourage growth of the next generation. And you could attempt to, deplete the seed bank this way, but perhaps it's wiser to just clip the flowers so that it's not disturbing the soil and it's not setting seed as well. Digging is best for shrubs with shallow root systems. You can also use a pickmatic to help leverage out larger root systems, and you want to remove rhizomes and root crowns when applicable. This can be effective for species like red barberry and multiflora rose. And clipping or cutting to suppress growth, prevent seed set, and slowly exhaust root stores can be effective. And this is useful for minimizing vine damage. So for those species that you just really can't get the roots out, cutting them back can be effective, one of the last resorts if nothing else is available to you. And for vines, you can cut as high as you can reach and down low to the ground. You can try to get out the root crowns, that would be ideal. But if you can't, this can go a long way in protecting trees that they may be choking out. And these manual control methods can be labor intensive or costly, and you'll likely need repeat treatments of them often over a season, over a few years. And that's why it's best to address the root system of a plant when possible so that the likelihood of needing to repeat is minimized. For cultural control, like we said, this is addressing human behavior and kind of altering the environment. So you can address this by increasing awareness, making people aware of invasive species and preventing their spread. Like we said, that's the most effective thing we can do is prevent new introductions, prevent the spread. And we can accomplish this through education, putting up signage, things like that. And then there's also a lot of different techniques that don't have to do with human behavior. They're more like tools and techniques like soil solarization. You can heat treat plants by covering them with a clear plastic that lets sunlight in and highly heats the plant, kind of acts like a super intense greenhouse. Thermal weed control through a direct flame, hot water, or steam will dehydrate or rupture plant cells. And this is best for herbs or small shrubs. For flame treating shrubs, you may want to directly apply the flame to the base of the shrub only. You don't want the whole plant to catch fire. You just want to kind of scorch it, and that acts similarly to the girdling technique, that you're going to interrupt the flow of plant materials. Prescribed grazing through goats or cattle suppresses invasive plants. Although grazers are often non-selective generalists, they don't care what they eat. They'll pretty much eat anything. And so if you have an area with a lot of native plants, you won't want to do this. And they have been shown to have varied levels of effectiveness, but this could be an interesting technique or last resort for an area that just has nothing but invasive species. Mulching or tarping is when you use a fabric or a tarp to cover way down and block out light to prevent regrowth of cut plants. And some attempt this on knotweed, woody invasive shrub stumps, or Phragmites. Prescribed fire can suppress some invasives, but others are resistant or spread after the fires. And lastly, competitive planting. Installing native plants decreases available resources for invasives to capitalize on. So invasive species really thrive on those disturbed environments. And when there's an excess of nutrients, of other resources, empty space, they're just going to potentially colonize rapidly. So just installing native plants in when you can on an area that's possibly bare soil as a preventative measure can be really hopeful and potentially effective. So now we'll get into some opportunities for further involvement. We recently launched our Invasive Species Spotters volunteer program, and we had a webinar on May 7th. And the recording is now available on our YouTube channel. We also have a spotters page at LIISMA.org, and we have some more resources coming soon. So essentially this volunteer program, we're asking volunteers to come on board and watch this webinar where we teach you to identify our top 10 emerging invasive plants right now. And then you will be acting as a spotter every time you go for a hike or a walk at a new park. And we ask that whether you find the invasive plant or not, that you fill out a simple survey 123 form to alert us that you've been looking for the plants and that you did or didn't find them. So you may think that telling us that you didn't find anything is not important, but not only does this allow us to track volunteer hours and support the program, but it tells us that people have been looking out for these species and that that's not an area we have to continue looking in at the moment. So they are, that even not detected reports are very helpful in helping us better understand distribution of invasive species because we have such a small team. And if you'd like to get involved, that you can visit the spotters page on our website, watch the recording, and there's a whole kind of step-by-step way to get onboarded into this program. And just threw this slide up last minute. We have a community science Long Island series happening this summer. May has already happened. I believe the webinar has been recorded. But essentially, this program pairs a webinar each month informing the public on different invasive species of interest, such as Phragmites, water chestnut, and other things, such as our emerging invasive program, the Invasive Species Spotters, and a BioBlitz in August. So these are webinars, educational webinars paired with in-person events. So another great way to get involved with invasive species events if you're looking to learn more, make a difference, and just have some fun. And that's all I have. I'm happy to answer any questions if there's any invasive species challenges you have that I could potentially help with, or just answer any questions. Thank you.
Wow, that was a lot of information. Okay.
Hope it wasn't too much.
I just post up the recording of the volunteer program, the invasive spotter training. So if everyone would like to watch it later, please save it. So you mentioned there's a question that you mentioned you recommend iNaturalist, but there are other applications available to use. Is there an advantage for using iNaturalist?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if that's your question, but or if specifically like the person who asked it, if there's other apps they have in mind. I haven't tried all of them, but for iNaturalist, it is an app, but it's also a website, and it allows you to post species. And so it uses the AI, like the algorithm, the artificial intelligence, to suggest identifications, but it doesn't just go that far. It allows the community of potentially like botanists and experts and someone who studies bees and people who are just really interested in this stuff to look at your observations and confirm them, suggest other IDs. And I think it creates a really nice community, and there's projects you can join on iNaturalist. You can go to the website and just explore what species are around. So I'm partial to it, but I don't think any other apps like Picture This or I don't know the others, but I don't think they have features like that.
There was a question. Do you know what is the ground cover that is in bloom now with yellow flowers and that's invasive? We have a few.
Yeah, I'm thinking it may be someone referring to lesser celandine, which probably just passed flowering like 2, 3 weeks ago. That is a widespread invasive species, and it is not necessarily a priority target for LIISMA, since it's more common. But certainly something worthwhile managing on a local level when it's threatening your park or your yard. And I could try to pull up a photo of that if you'd like to confirm whether that may be the species we're talking about.
Yes, and I think another one that has yellow flower is the mock strawberry.
Yes. That one slipped my mind, yeah. Um, I think that one is closer to non-native and introduced and possibly naturalized. Um, I can here, I'll show you an example of how to use these resources. I can look it up to see if it's on the tier list, if
That would
my
be great.
computer would load. Maybe it's not going to.
So Land Green has been battering mustard garlic, bittersweet, and wisteria. Do you have any advice for those?
So, can you list the species again? Wisteria,
Bittersweet
bittersweet.
and garlic mustard.
Okay. So I touched a little bit on garlic mustard, and one thing I didn't mention was that research has shown that not only like does removing it create disturbance in the soil that creates an environment for garlic mustard to continue germinating and thriving, but research also shows that over time, if left alone, garlic mustard populations will kind of level off and diminish. And so therefore the like functional impact is probably not going to be as significant over time. So for garlic mustard, if you are very bothered by it, I would suggest clipping it down and not pulling it up. For bittersweet, for those that aren't familiar, unfortunately, most likely all are. This is a woody vine that can create these really thick vines choking out trees. And for that one, you'll just want to clip as high as you can, as low as you can, and focus on getting out the root crowns as best you can. And if you have these really thick vines, like they can get the roots and the vines can get, I don't know, 4 inches across in width, maybe, or more. So obviously you'll have to saw them in that case. But if you have root crowns or root runners that are like that large, you'll want to saw them and potentially use a pickmatic, like I mentioned, for those stubborn root crowns. So you'll kind of wedge that underneath the roots and use your own leverage to push up the root crowns. So that way you're not breaking your back over it. And wisteria, personally, I haven't managed that much. Not sure if I have, but I would gather that it's similar to other invasive vines, where you want to kind of target it climbing and choking things out, cut it high and low, and focus on the root crowns.
And about what is your thought on poison ivy?
Yeah, fun question. Most people or many people think poison ivy is invasive. It is not. It's a native species that creates wildlife, like supports wildlife with its berries. I'm sure there are even native insects that host on the leaves. Um, I would say if it's really harming you and somewhere it shouldn't be, remove with caution. Otherwise, I would just try to leave it alone when you can.
I guess leaves of three, let it be.
Yes.
Um, do you have a suggestion to effectively eliminate low-growing leafy bamboo from the garden?
Hmm. Leafy bamboo. So is this not a clumping bamboo? I'm not familiar. Or a running bamboo, rather.
I would say it's a running bamboo.
Running. I'm not familiar with that specific type of bamboo. Bamboo is always a huge challenge. Um, I believe that it is treatable with herbicide by stem injection. I would, of course, hire a professional if you're looking to do that. Um, Otherwise, one of the only other effective measures may be installing a barrier, as I mentioned previously. But I may have to do further research if you wanted more recommendations.
And a lot of people would ask to just dig it out, right? Ooh. Um, what is the best way to get rid of hairy bittercress?
Very bitter crust.
It is an
It
annual.
okay.
So I actually have experience with it. My lawn was overrun with it one year and it sent up white flower stalks. And what I ended up doing is I mow my lawn early April when it was flowering, and I catch all the seed heads and the flower heads into a bag and I dispose of it. And because it's an annual, I did not see nearly as many the year after or the year after that. Whatever was left in the garden, I did pull out, but from the lawn, because just mow it really low early on when it's white flowering. And that's how I get rid of mine.
Yeah, sounds perfect.
Okay, and then there is one about English ivy. So Kathleen has been removing, English ivy from her backyard, but now they are spreading into the lawn so do you have any tips from removing ivy from grass?
Yeah, I've noticed something similar as well in my lawn. And I've tried to pull it from the surrounding areas. Um, I don't think mowing is very effective. I guess the only thing I've noticed that works is when you're able to kind of find the little vine that's starting to be embedded in the grass and kind of pulling at that and tracking it back to like where it roots at the ground, because often you may just have it kind of laying over the grass sort of and not like exactly rooted everywhere. Um, but yeah, locating the root crowns would probably be the most important thing.
Okay, so there is a question about a walnut tree. Mindy have a walnut tree and now she has more small trees and they have really long straight root system. Would this be considered an invasive or can there be an invasive that's look like a walnut tree?
Good question. If it's black walnut, that is a native species. Does this person ask because they see it impeding other species, harming other species? Because black walnut releases, you all may already know this, releases a chemical through its roots that will inhibit some other species. Some things can grow near it, but some can't. Um, and I would say, but maybe Tree of Heaven looks a little bit like black walnut, but if you try out one of those ID tips of those websites or apps or something that I suggested, you can probably compare some photos and check which species you have.
There is a question about Japanese knotweed. What do you recommend for Japanese knotweed? Tarp or herbicide treatment in the fall?
Yeah, you can certainly do tarping and herbicide in the fall. That's the correct timing for it. Honestly, knotweed is a really tricky one, even for experts. Even when people apply herbicide, it can be resistant. Prevention is really important, trying to contain it where it is. You could try solarizing or tarping. Our partners at New York State Parks have experimented with a 3x3 method where they cut the knotweed down to the ground 3 times a season for 3 years and have kind of seen it suppressed that way a little bit. But it doesn't fully kill the knotweed. So kind of just hit it with everything you have and everything you can and see what sticks, unfortunately.
Okay. More question on tree of heaven. What can be done with a very large female tree of heaven that spreads seeds everywhere?
Tree of Heaven's another tough one. As I mentioned earlier, it can be girdled. It can be injected with herbicide. It can be cut down. Our partners at the Sisters of St. Joseph, they have a ecological sustainability program there on their grounds. And so they maintain woodlands there. And they had a project in which they did forestry mowing on a stand of Tree of Heaven that were somewhat mature. They weren't saplings. So there are ways to take down a tree, but you just may need to consult a a professional arborist or a landscaper to like fully remove that tree, because cutting it can make it resprout. Girdling may not be effective for such a large tree, and herbicide could potentially be effective, but you'll definitely want to consult an expert for that.
And we have questions on maple saplings, specifically Norway maple saplings.
Take it on.
This is Francesca's question. I'm trying to word it correctly. So is there native plants or trees that would be able to compete with the Norway maples overhanging shade and a black walnut nearby? I think this is a
Ooh.
more plant question.
Yeah, a double whammy. It is definitely hard for plants to get enough light under those broad leaves of the Norway maple. There's a few things I might suggest. You could potentially try to thin the canopy of the Norway maple. Maybe that's more of a question for an arborist. I'm not an arborist. But potentially thinning the canopy, selectively trimming some branches in a safe way if you're trying to access more light to the understory where this is. And or selecting shade tolerant plants that really will thrive in that shady environment. And as far as black walnut, there are some species that are tolerant of black walnut. You would have to research which species those are. There's definitely resources online for that and research that's been done. I'm thinking of a tool that I think I found out from a Rewild talk, where you can search for native plants that fit certain criteria. But I don't know if they have a black walnut and shade filter, but that would be useful if they did. Maybe you'd have to cross-reference a few guides that way to figure that out. Oh, locust. Locust.
Yes.
What is the question regarding locust? Is it inhibiting other plant growths? I'm not sure.
Oh, I think that's in conjunction with a black locust and a Norway maple.
Mm-hmm.
I can, Dee, I can clarify. The trees have gotten bigger over time and they completely overhang the yard. So my entire lawn is Norway maple seedlings where I still have lawn. And So I put in a service berry recently to try and, sort of grow things on my side. But when you have neighbors that have these trees that are tremendous that just keep growing, and yes, I would have to consult an arborist. And actually, I've thought of, I contacted Spadefoot to see what they can do. But when you cut back, half of somebody's tree, because half of it is in your yard, you risk killing their tree. But it is now. I understand also from Kimberly Simon that if you plant Norway maples, give off a chemical that forces other things not to thrive. So I don't know how easy those are to combat, or if they're on your list of things that are, invasive, that are to be eradicated.
I wasn't aware that Norway maples release chemicals like that. Yeah, it is a tiered species. I believe it's a tier 4. It's widespread and it's regulated as well. A lot of people do have the Norway maples. And at this point, it's just a problem that time is going to solve. Unfortunately, it's in our forests. It's in our canopy of our forests, and over time, in effectively managed forests, saplings should be, removed, but they can't just be removed from the canopy and the overstory layer. At this time, you'd have too many gaps, and those would be colonized by invasive species. So hopefully we see a decline in Norway maple over time, and with increasing like cultural awareness and like changes, hopefully shift towards native plants and away from even regulated species, whether it's a Norway maple that doesn't reproduce or viably doesn't reproduce. But yeah, hopefully that we see less of it over time, and wish there was a better answer.
This one, this is interesting about control burns. Do you help groups get control burns?
We haven't. We support, using prescribed fire to help manage ecosystems and just maintain a fire regime where they are, historically necessary. We have partners who implement these projects, like the Pine Barrens Commission, and I believe the DEC as well. But we haven't done burns ourselves, and we could potentially provide resources or connect you with other experts, but we don't do that ourselves or support those projects directly.
So I put onto the chat a few resources. There's a website, Go Native Long Island, where this amazing lady has put up a lot of information on how to manually remove common invasives in our garden and in our park. So definitely check it out. There's information on English ivy, on lesser celandine, on bittersweet, on knotweed. So Go Native Long Island. I'm going to share it again. And the wildflower, the Lady Bird Johnson wildflower website is where you can find plants that have certain characteristics. So that will help you with a lot of your plant selection. Do you have, there's another question on butterfly bush. Some states list it as invasive. Do you have any thought on butterfly bush?
It is. I think it may be invasive in New York, and if some other, especially in the Northeast, states list it as invasive, I would think that it's invasive here. I wouldn't recommend planting it generally, whether or not it is officially listed as invasive. There are far better plants to use to support our butterflies and our pollinators. And if something isn't acting invasively in New York now, it may be what's called a sleeper species, where there's kind of this lag period in which it's been introduced, but the environmental conditions aren't quite right, or it needs more time to fully establish itself. And you may see a plant, remaining in an ornamental setting and controlled environment, and then kind of exploding and spreading eventually. So that's why I would just suggest sticking to native plants as much as you can, even if something's not invasive officially.
Thank you so much. That is a very sound advice. Again, thank you, Kassidy. It is amazing, great information, and Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. And we hope to see you on our next meeting.
Thank you for having me.